My name's Gregory Allan, and along with Cindy Chiang, I'm going to talk about the genus Byblis, more commonly known as the rainbow plants. First of all, I'm going to introduce the genus. There are currently 8 species of Byblis which are recognised. There are 2 perennial species, Byblis gigantea and Byblis lamellata. Byblis gigantea is depicted on the right hand side of the cover slide of this presentation. The annual species are more numerous. We have Byblis aquatica, which is depicted on this slide, Byblis filifolia, Byblis guiahoi, which is also depicted on the the title slide of this presentation on the left hand side. There's also Byblis liniflora, Byblis pilbarana and Byblis rarida. Most species of Byblis are endemic to Australia, although Byblis liniflora and probably also Byblis aquatica can also be found in the southern parts of the island of New Guinea. The perennial species of Byblis are found around and to the north of Perth, Western Australia, whilst the annual species are found in northern tropical regions. All Byblis have filiform leaves which arise from an aerial stem, and all species produce showy flowers with striking yellow anthers. On the right here you can see the striking and beautiful flowers of Byblis pilbarana. Byblis are rare in cultivation and rarely offered for sale. This is very unfortunate because the genus includes perhaps the most beautiful of all carnivorous plants. Byblis is also an understudied genus, which is very interesting from a botanical perspective. There's a lot more that we need to learn about Byblis. I'll now give an overview of Carnivory in Byblis. Now, historically, indeed, ever since the time of Charles Darwin, the genus has been treated as a genus of passive flypaper traps. In fact, Byblis are active carnivores with motile traps that move. They have mucilage-tipped tentacles which are used for trapping prey, and sessile glands on the leaf surface which secrete digestive enzymes and then also perform the function of absorbing the products of digestion. Each tentacle comprises a single cell which collapses inwards when it captures prey and thereby conveys the prey to the leaf surface. This movement seems to be achieved through a hydraulic mechanism involving a sudden loss of cell turgidity. It appears that the fluid which is present inside the tentacle cells, which keeps the tentacle cells rigid, suddenly drains, which causes the collapse of the cell. For more information on this, I have written an article which was published in 2019 in the Carnivorous Plant newsletter. It's been doubted on several occasions whether Byblis are fully carnivorous. However, enzymes have been detected in most species, and a carnivorous plant expert called Laura Skates from Australia has used stable isotope techniques to prove nitrogen sequestration in most species in the genus. So there's little doubt now as to whether they are carnivorous. The next 3 slides show the movement of Byblis traps. In this first photo you can see that this fly wing in the centre here has just been placed on the leaf. The second photo it's been conveyed far closer to the leaf, and in the third photo it's in contact with the leaf and the sessile glands on the leaf surface have started to secrete digestive fluids. Another interesting aspect of carnivory in Byblis is that the perennial Byblis appear to practice digestion and absorption almost exclusively at night. I conducted experiments on Byblis gigantea which showed this to be the case, and rather less formal observations have also suggested that Byblis lamellata, the other perennial species, behaves in a similar manner. If whenever prey is caught, whether it's day or night, the secretion of digestive fluids and the absorption doesn't take place until night time. This might perhaps be an adaptation to the harsh climates in the habitats of these species. They live where the sun is fierce, and it might cause precious digestive fluids to evaporate if they were released during the day. Again, I've published an article on this in the Carnivorous Plant newsletter if you require any further information or you're interested in reading more about it. The next slides depict nocturnal digestion in Byblis gigantea. If you can see on the left-hand side here, there's a pool of fluid just below the cheese that's been artificially added. And this photo was taken early in the morning, just after digestion had finished, but before the fluids had all been reabsorbed. And on the right hand side here you can see a fly which was captured naturally, and you can see this photo was taken at night and its head is enveloped in digestive fluids. You can also see a Setocoris bug lurking in the background on the left of the right hand photo. And that leads me to the final point of this introduction, which is about Setocoris. In nature, all Byblis species are inhabited by bugs from the genus Setocoris. These bugs are able to walk freely amongst the sticky glands of Byblis. And it appears that this peculiar quality supports their lifestyle because they prey on insects which have been trapped by the Byblis plants. It does seem very, very likely that the Byblis benefit from the droppings of the Setocoris. Now, I keep Setocoris bibliphilius on my perennial Byblis. They're very easy to keep, and indeed they often spread to other carnivorous plant species which are growing near the Byblis plants, although of course if you have Setocoris you mustn't use pesticides. You can see them in the picture here. To the right of the fly you can see the yellowish green juvenile, and above it you can see the ant-like adult Setocoris.
Hi everyone, let's talk about the different species of Byblis. There are two perennial species. They are gigantea and lamellata. Gigantea and lamellata are the two largest species in the genus. Here is a bee, gigantea. I believe that it is a plant that Greg grew in his greenhouse. Let's take a look at another specimen that he grows. I believe all of you will agree with me that this is a stunning centerpiece on the dining table. This is a mature plant and it's flowering. There are many branches, as you can see on this specimen plant. B. lamellata. B. lamellata and gigantea has got very similar growth habits. Many of the growers have actually been able to distinguish the two species mostly based on the different morphology of their seeds. Now let's talk about the 6 annual species. There are 6 annual species. There's Aquatica, Liniflora, Rorida, Gehoi, Filifolia, and Pilbarana. Let's take a look at the Aquatica and Liniflora. B. aquatica, it's a petite species just like Liniflora. It tends to be maroon in bright and intense light, while Liniflora tends to be more green. However, both Aquatica and Liniflora are able to self-pollinate, which makes the two species easy to propagate. B. rorida has been highly sought after for its deeply serrated flowers. At a glance, I think it's pretty easy for even new growers to be able to tell rorida apart from other annual species. B. filifolia, it's what I would term as the most variable of the 6 annual species because of its growth habits. Filifolia tends to grow differently. It can be very tall, it can be very bushy, it can have white flowers, it can have lilac flowers, it can have round, non-serrated flower petals. And the photo here shows how a form that has deeply serrated flower petals end up looking quite like the Byblis arida. Byblis gehoai, it's the most heavily branching in terms of growth habits. It is also the species that is the largest in terms of the diameter of the whole plant, but there are filifolia forms that are able to grow like gehoai as well. Pilbarana. Pilbarana at this moment, it's most rare in collection. Even for myself, I've actually lost it because my last plant was a single plant and I was unable to get seeds without another different plant for cross-pollination. Well, now let's take a look at growing Byblis in the tropics. Just some background. I live in Singapore. We have 365 days that are hot and extremely humid. We have temperature ranging from about 23 to about 34 degrees Celsius. The average ambient humidity is about 65 to 80%. And although we do not have the 4 seasons and we have sunshine nearly all year round, there are some challenges which I will share with you of growing Byblis in Southeast Asia. On the left, you see some of the plants that I've grown in natural light, and on the right are flowers that are formed with natural sunlight in Singapore. Now, there are some challenges that I face while growing Byblis in Singapore. I live in a high-rise apartment and I only have light coming in from one side of the window. And in order to keep the plants in a nice growth form, I have to keep turning the plants several times a week. The other challenge would be that I have to use a lot of wooden sticks to keep the plants upright in order to prevent them from flopping over and leaning on other plants. So because of this issue, I've actually been trying to use artificial lighting for growing Byblis in Singapore. Now for artificial light, for the past few years, I've been trying 2 different types of lighting. The first one is what you see on the left-hand side. It's what we call a par lamp. Par lamp gives intense light over a smaller area. And on the right, I have the Liniflora under LED tubes. LED tubes cover a larger area, but the intensity of the light is actually lower. So what are some of the challenges of growing Byblis even under artificial lighting? The plants heat the lamp or the tube even with sufficient light, as we soon run out of vertical space, even for smaller species, and higher wattage is it's required, and the demand for space is actually worse for larger species like the gehoi. So what are some of the recommendations that I have for growers in the tropical region? For garden growers, Byblis should be grown in full sun, but they need to be sheltered against torrential rain, which can actually break the foliage. And for apartment growers like myself, the west-facing windowsill is the best to maximize the amount of light that the plant can receive throughout the year. I've come to the end of my part, so thank you for your time. I'll pass this to Greg.
This part of the presentation deals with the cultivation of Byblis in temperate regions. I've been growing Byblis in Birmingham in the United Kingdom for more than 15 years. Here you can see many species growing happily alongside Sarracenia and other carnivores in my greenhouse. I'll start with the perennial species. As these are rarely found for sale, if you're going to grow them, you'll probably have to start from seed. In nature, germination is stimulated by fire, so the seeds require treatment. I tend to obtain very good results soaking the seeds for 4 to 5 days in a gibberellic acid solution of 500 parts per million. Other growers, however, have reported success with smoke discs and other types of smoke treatment. You can see in the photo on the right here, there's a seedling that's just germinated. You can see the white shoot emerging from the black seed. Once you get to this point, you need to note that seedlings are very prone to damp off, which is a fungus which kills seedlings. I've obtained the best results growing seedlings indoors under grow lights. However, I have successfully grown them in a greenhouse in full sun as well. Okay, but if you're using a greenhouse for germination, you do need to be prepared to lose a certain number of your plants to fungal infection. Seedlings do very well with a wet substrate. However, note that they're very, very, very vulnerable to slug and snail attacks. They seem to be terribly attractive to slugs and snails. So if you're growing seedlings or young plants in a greenhouse, you will need to take precautions to prevent them from being eaten. In terms of substrate, it's very important to use an airy, sandy substrate. I use approximately 3 parts perlite to 2 parts lime-free sand to 1 part moss peat. Seedlings, once they've developed a few leaves, should be transported or transplanted into pots which are about 10 centimetres deep. Once the plantlets reach about 12 centimetres or so in height, they should be very, very, very carefully transplanted into deep pots which have a depth of at least 20 centimetres. And be very careful when you transplant them, because they have surprisingly long and very brittle root systems, even when they're very small. Adult plants appreciate a top layer of pure sand. I give my adult plants a top layer of about 1 centimetre of sand on top of the substrate. Now, the substrate of adult plants should be kept damp. I water mine on the tray system, but I allow the tray to dry out before replenishing it. In the winter, I keep them on the dry side, and I've recently discovered that Byblis lamellata seems to appreciate very dry winter conditions. I've recently been successful not watering at all for around 3 months. When you're watering your plants in the summer, if you've got a top layer of pure sand, that should always remain dry. So if the top layer of pure sand is wet, that's a good sign that you're overwatering your plants. In terms of location, I grow my plants in full sun in a frost-free greenhouse, although I've also successfully grown them on a sunny windowsill, and I understand that they also do well in conservatories. I also understand from other growers that if you live in a climate that's a bit warmer and sunnier than that in the United Kingdom, you can grow them outside in the summer. Unless you live in a place which doesn't have frosts, you'll need to protect your plants in winter. I have a heated greenhouse which is frost free, so I keep them in there all year round. But if you don't have a greenhouse, or if you have a greenhouse which is not heated and which might be exposed to frosts, you can overwinter your plants indoors on a cool windowsill. They like being fertilised. They seem to respond very well to orchid fertiliser. I spray mine in the growing season regularly with orchid fertiliser and flood the water trays with the fertiliser solution. Other growers have also reported great success with Osmocote and with Maxi. In terms of the way the plants grow, they form stems over the growing period, and you can see this very sticky Byblis lamellata stem on the right here. These stems start to become too tall and straggly by autumn. At this point, don't do anything with them, because new growth points should appear towards the base of the stems in later winter or early spring. Once the new growth points start to form stems, you can prune away the old stems and the new stems will form nice bushy plants. In terms of propagation, it's best achieved by seed. Flowers need to be hand-pollinated with pollen from a genetically distinct individual. The Perennial Byblis will, generally speaking, not be self-pollinated, although I have heard rumours of a clone of Byblis gigantea which will self-pollinate. I've never actually encountered it though. Now, in order to obtain pollen, you need to vigorously but gently brush the anthers, the yellow bits in the middle of the flower in the photo. You can do it with a toothpick or a credit card edge, or even with your fingernail. Once the pollen has been released, you can use some paper or a brush or something to transfer it to the stigma of other flowers. The stigma is the bit on the right of the flower, on the right of the centre of the flower in the photo. So you need to transfer the pollen to the stigma of the flower of another plant, which is genetically distinct from the plant from which you've obtained the pollen. Some growers have also reported success with stem cuttings, although I tend to get good germination each year from my seeds, so I don't tend to bother trying to obtain cuttings, but I think it can be done. What must be avoided when growing perennial Byblis? First of all, sodden substrate, especially when combined with a heavy substrate containing too much peat. Okay, I have seen a lot of recommendations to grow them in a mixture of peat and sand. I wouldn't recommend that. It seems in the longer term to be a death sentence. At least 50% perlite will give you much better success. They're acid-loving plants, so alkaline conditions will be no good, which means that if you live somewhere where the tap water is not soft water, tap water won't be any good for them either. They don't like a lack of light. They're plants that enjoy full sun, and certainly in Britain it can be a challenge getting them through the winter. They don't like dark, damp, cold, humid conditions. I use additional lighting in the winter, although I did for several years manage to overwinter them without the artificial lighting, but they do seem to appreciate it. And the winter in places which don't get much sunlight is quite a dangerous time for these plants. However, they don't like excessive heat in winter either. They're reputed to be near impossible to grow in tropical regions, so they like cool, bright winters with good air circulation. You have to be very careful when you're repotting them, as I've suggested already, and they particularly hate being repotted in late summer or autumn or winter. If you have to repot them, spring's the best time. You also need to watch out for aphids in the winter months. In the summer months, the plants seem to be too sticky to be bothered by aphids, but they can be attacked in the winter months, so keep an eye out. The annual species require slightly different conditions. They're also difficult to obtain, and they're also usually started from seed. Byblis liniflora, the plant depicted on this slide here, seeds will germinate without treatment in gibberellic acid, but the other species, generally speaking, do require gibberellic acid treatment. You might get a bit of germination without it, but for good reliable germination, gibberellic acid is strongly recommended. I tend to soak for 2 to 3 days for the annual species. That seems to be sufficient. The seeds germinate in warm, bright and humid conditions. In the United Kingdom, I use a heated terrarium with bright grow lights. In terms of substrate, I use a substrate of 3 parts perlite to 2 parts ericaceous compost. That's compost for acid-loving plants, or a substrate of 3 parts perlite to 1 part ericaceous compost to 1 part moss peat. You can also use 3 parts perlite to 2 parts moss peat. The smaller species, that is Aquatica, Liniflora, Pilbarana and Rorida, can be grown all year round in a terrarium. Byblis filifolia and Byblis guiahoi, however, become too large for most terraria. Once they are subadult plants, all of the species do well in a very, very sunny, temperate greenhouse. Or indeed on a sunny windowsill. I've grown mine in the United Kingdom in an unheated greenhouse from June onwards. Of course, if your climate's warmer, you'll probably be able to grow them in the greenhouse from earlier on in the year. And I suppose in much warmer climates, you could dispense altogether with the terrarium, and you could germinate them and complete the entire life cycle in the greenhouse. The larger species, that's Byblis filifolia and guiahoi, appreciate deep pots. They grow best in pots that are around 20 centimetres deep. They'll get huge and bushy, and an individual plant can have dozens and dozens of flowers open at the same time, as you can see from this Byblis filifolia plant on the right. In terms of propagation, I propagate my plants by seed. In the tropics, I know that cuttings are successful. The problem in temperate regions is getting them through the winter. I find that it's far better just to collect seed and let them die off in the winter and start again in the spring. Byblis aquatica and Byblis liniflora are self-fertile. It's helpful to tease the anthers a little bit to release pollen of these plants, but you don't need to bother cross-pollinating with the other individual plants. But the other species have to be cross-pollinated in the same way as are recommended for the perennial species. Feeding is hugely important. Very vigorous plants can be produced through frequent feeding. If the plants are fed with crushed flake fish food or fragments of bloodworm, they'll greatly appreciate it, and you can sprinkle this flake fish food or the fragments of bloodworm directly onto the stalked glands, onto the tentacles, and the plants will thank you for it. They also respond very well to feeding. I use orchid fertilizer, which I spray on the foliage and use to flood the water trays. Other growers have reported great success with Osmocote and Maxi. In order for vigorous growth, feeding or fertilising, and preferably both, is essential. In terms of the things that the annuals don't like, it's pretty much the same as for the perennial species. They hate substrate which is too heavy and too waterlogged. They don't like shade. They don't like frosts. So in that respect, they're rather similar. But on the whole, they prefer sunnier, more humid conditions than the perennial species. And happy annual Byblis plants will be very bushy with multiple growth points, as can be seen from the Byblis filifolia plant here. From left to right on this slide, we've got Byblis rorida, Byblis guiahoi and Byblis aquatica. And if you give your plants the correct substrate, a lot of sun, and they're well fed, all the species will be very spectacular. They'll produce lots and lots of flowers, and they'll be very bushy. So I really hope that some people decide to start growing Byblis as a result of this presentation, and if you do start growing Byblis, I wish you all the very, very best of luck.